Hey, High Rock. My name is Megan, and I'm one of the pastors here. I'm so glad to be with you today as we continue in our Bless series, where we're considering how we might practically bless our neighbors because we too have been blessed through Christ. Even more than as individuals, as a church, we are considering how we don't want to go back to normal and that we have to take on a communal identity. Now, this is a unique communal identity as a missional community that is meant to participate with Christ in God's work in the world. If you haven't started this series yet, I'd really encourage you to go back to Pastor John's sermon that kicks it off to hear why we think that this is a timely framework for us and to consider why beginning with prayer is crucial. Today, we're going to consider how listening to those around us is one of the best ways we can love them and to participate with Christ. To encourage us to think about participating in active listening today, I'm going to give you a little challenge. From this point on in the sermon, write down as many song titles as you hear me use as I speak. I have a Spotify playlist that's linked in the comment section or description that you can check your work by at the end. These will all be songs that I have intentionally put in, and it definitely favors people who listen to similar music as me, but I've asked other people to jump in with theirs too, so stop, collaborate, and listen. So, as I've been mulling on today's text and the idea of listening, I was struck by how many ways I can use that word, listen. So I try to pay attention. A little context to set up this scene. I have two kids, Brady and Luke, and we live in a densely populated area. Okay, 4:50 a.m. Okay, I gotta listen to my daily audio Bible. 5:35 a.m. when my CrossFit coach puts on this country music song, play it again for our warm-up. Why are we listening to this right now, Rick? Please don't play it again. 6:10 in the middle of my workout when my CrossFit coach puts on My Power from Beyonce's Lion King soundtrack and yells at me, "Is this what you want to listen to, Megan?" And I just give him a thumbs up because I can't breathe, much less yell back. After that, 6:35 a.m. when I walk in the door and my youngest is yelling back and forth out the window with our neighbor in the same building. "Luke, please stop yelling. People are sleeping. They don't want to listen to that right now." 7:45 a.m. Brady, please listen to your brother when he asks you to stop doing that. That is not kind. 7:50 a.m. Luke, you need to stop and listen to Brady when he asks you to stop too, dude. 8:15 a.m. Guys, stop listening to Go Cubs Go on Alexa and go brush your teeth. We got to get going. 8:30 a.m. while in the car. Okay, what do we want to listen to on the way to school? 8:31 a.m. No, I won't turn it up any louder. I cannot listen to myself think. 8:35 a.m. Redbones, Come and Get Your Love finishes and Luke says, "Mom, can we listen to that again?" I reply, "Absolutely," and proceed to crank it up. 8:45 a.m. Okay, Brady, I cannot wait to hear about your school day and to hear from your teachers about how you were a great listener today. I love you. See you. Okay, well, I could keep going, but I won't because that's a lot in the span of a couple of hours. And by my count, there were 4 song gimmies in that, so you're on the board now, y'all. I use the word listen or think about the practice of listening a lot. What I'm listening to, what my kids are listening to, whether they're listening to me or if I'm listening to them or others. It's a lot. When I ask my kids to listen, it's because what I have to say to them is important for them. I'm not just talking for my own benefit, no matter what they think, but it's actually for theirs too. What I'm learning about my kids, though, is that they don't always think that what I have to say is important. They're selective listeners. And honestly, at first, that really ticks me off when they're just like, "Okay, Mom, I'm going to tune you out." I can get annoyed at first in that first reaction when they don't listen to me because it slows us down and it just feels disrespectful. But my first reactions are often clues that I can follow to what's going on underneath those reactions. Sometimes they're prompts from the Holy Spirit, and sometimes they're a more selfish, sinful response. So when I have a non-neutral reaction, like being annoyed, I've tried to stop and pay attention to what's actually going on underneath. Often what's under my annoyance, or really anger, is the fact that when my kids don't listen to me, I feel undervalued or untrusted. Don't they know that I love them and want the best for them? Don't they realize that if they just listen to me, I can help make their lives easier? It can make us feel so far apart instead of operating as a unit, as a family. I hear from parents of older kids that just gets harder as kids get older, and that at some point it's more common to just not listen to each other anymore, and that those relationships can actually feel quite distant. But actually, that's probably not much different than the language my husband or I would use to describe some of our biggest fights. They've happened when one of us feels like the other hasn't listened to the simple ways that we could adjust our behavior or our attitude so that we don't keep on running into the same problems again and again. On weeks where we're really at each other's throats and both feel like we're not being listened to, the default responses are often, if she could just learn to relax, or if he could just take a little more initiative. I mean, sweet dreams are made of this. But honestly, those really aren't the issues. We assume that we know what the other person needs, and instead of doing the harder work of slowing down and listening, we talk over each other or try to fix it the wrong way and only make things worse. But if we were really listening to each other, we'd have heard the things that were under those quick responses. It's not just me who has stuff going on under those reactions. It's my kids, it's my spouse, my friends, my neighbors. But when I'm not slowing down long enough to listen to myself or to others, I miss it. I think it's one of the things that we've expressed one too many times that makes us feel valued or loved. It just feels like that other person isn't listening. It's the stuff that we're fearful of or insecure about. Brad wishes I set better boundaries around resting because he knows that I need that to be healthy. And I wish that he could appreciate how much work it is to keep our lives moving and help me without me having to ask. Being a woman is a full-time job. My kids really value playing, and they don't want the fun to end. Why would they stop and hurry up to get going to school? Or are they angry that their sibling keeps pestering them when they don't know how to make them stop without hitting them? I mean, it's not that they're purposefully trying to disrespect me or hurt their brother. Brad isn't trying to make me feel guilty for working, and I'm not trying to neglect how much he actually does for our family. But all of our first responses, when we're not really listening, can make the space between us feel massive. It tends to lead to further division instead of healing unification. And if we're honest, we all can be guilty of not really listening to what's going on inside and around us, but selectively filtering out conversations, information, and people. I guess it's no wonder that it might be hard to have meaningful relationships with our neighbors. We're just not really listening to each other. Everyone feels unheard, unseen, and unloved for who they are. We'll take a break here to talk about listening and being heard with the people around you or in the chat. If you'd like, feel free to press pause and extend your conversation time. Welcome back. Today's text comes from John's Gospel, where we encounter a man who was laying beside the pool in Bethesda, who had been sick for 38 years. He was waiting for healing in a pool that was rumored to be able to heal. The text implies that he was unable to move quickly on his own, because as Jesus meets him and talks with him, he says that he hasn't been able to get into the healing waters fast enough, that someone always gets in ahead of him. As I'm reading this, a couple of things stood out to me that I wondered if John was trying to help us identify. First, this man has been alone for a long time. In Jesus' time, having a chronic illness would have meant that he wasn't allowed to be in a home or a community with other non-disabled people for fear of harming them or cursing them, in a sense. The prevalent view that historians have uncovered was that disabilities like this were a sign of sin, of being impure. So access to community was cut off for fear of contamination. Another aspect of the story that leads me to believe he was really alone was that he couldn't get to the pool quickly. Hypothetically, if he had friends or family around him, they could help him get into the pool, but he wasn't able to do that on his own. In this narrative, Jesus doesn't avoid this person. Instead, he asks him a question and then he listens to his reply. Maybe it seems like the man's answer is obvious, but as we're reading this text, we have to remember Jesus and the man are two figures in this story, but Jesus' audience and John's audience would have been listening too. Jesus' engagement with this man would have had a huge ripple effect because he chose to engage and listen. Jesus asks, "Do you want to be made well?" And the man doesn't say yes. I mean, maybe like us, he thought that the answer was implied, but that's not actually what's captured. Instead, he tells Jesus, "I don't have anyone to help me get well. I'm alone." As we see, as Jesus listens, he does heal this man. But because he's really listening, he's able to address this in the ways that get at what's going on underneath, not just on the surface. First, Jesus heals his legs, and the man walks away to the temple. Because he was an outcast due to his chronic illness, he would have had to go to the temple for a ritual cleansing, to be sort of signed off on by the religious authorities. They question how, but he doesn't even know. He doesn't even know Jesus' last name. But going to be identified as an acceptable member of the community would have been necessary to get at what might be his root pain that we could imply from the text: isolation. Remember, when Jesus answered if he wanted to be made well, he said he couldn't be well because he was alone. Even with his condition relieved, he still hadn't had a transformative encounter that has brought full healing. When we aren't listened to or when we don't listen to others, we feel disconnected, unheard, unseen, and unloved. I know when I feel that way, I'm generally just concerned with how I'm going to make it through my day. I don't have the capacity to actually listen to others or to help partner with Jesus in bringing healing. That's why what Jesus did was so helpful. Jesus follows up with this man after he had been restored to fellowship in the temple and reminds him that he has a choice. He too has the choice to choose the life of isolation or to choose one that allows him to stay in the community. But the kicker actually is what happens next. The man tells the authorities that he's been healed by Jesus, who then start persecuting Jesus for healing on the Sabbath. Why was this a big deal? A very simplistic breakdown of the function of the laws that the Jewish people kept was to make sure that they were, as much as possible, being set apart, that they were a holy people. They wanted to show that God was different than all of the other gods around them at the time, and that the law was set up as a way of proving faithfulness to God. Their God was love and life, restoration and freedom. But the other gods around them were agents of chaos and death and fear. So, in theory, the law was supposed to help them remember God so that they could listen to God and participate in the world as God's people. But the protection of the law hadn't actually helped them remember that God was about restoration and freedom. No, protecting the letter of the law had kept this man isolated and trapped. He could never break the chain that was keeping him alone. He needed his community to do that with him. When his community is badgering Jesus for having healed on the Sabbath, Jesus' response tells us something about Jesus' relationship to God and how his listening to God formed his response. When Jesus replied that he was going to be working on the day of rest because God was working, it implies that Jesus was paying attention to how God was at work and then chose to participate in that. The law was meant to help people listen to God, but they weren't using it that way. Jesus' posture towards God was that of a close relationship. He had access to God and he could have a talk with God. He could listen to God. And when he listened, he could respond with God's character. In this instance, Jesus remembered God's character of healing through bringing people from isolation into community. This verse in Deuteronomy was spoken to the people of Israel, who had been living in exile in a foreign empire, where it was even easier to forget God and to not listen to him. But no matter how busy they were, no matter how much they were ignoring God at work in their lives and the lives of their neighbors, God was still speaking and moving. This was a narration of their history, where they were reminded that one of their fathers of their faith, Jacob, and their ancestors also had been isolated, where it was hard to hear God. But God had been faithful and continued to speak and cared for them and brought them into a place where they were no longer alone or malnourished. As Jesus listened to what was going on underneath the surface for that man, he saw this isolation as a place of brokenness. He listened and remembered the way that God moved towards healing and responded with active love for this man because God is love. So Jesus listened to God and then listened to the man who had been on the margins, and through listening, responded in a way that started the process of healing. But what makes Jesus so radical is that he didn't just stop there. He also invited this man's community to respond with love. His awareness of God compelled him to live in such a way that he troubled their waters and asked them to consider that they needed to listen to God and respond with healing as well. Their fundamentalist keeping of the law was not creating a community that could listen, respond, and heal like God. They needed a different way, and Jesus offered it to them. Let's take a minute now to reflect on our relationships with communities and when they've helped or hurt us. Welcome back. Really intentionally listening changes things in us. And this is why beginning with prayer is so important here. When we start from being rooted in connection to God, we start to see, hear, and respond like God. It changes the way that we understand and see people. Instead of talking over people or assuming the worst about them, we sense invitations to see others as God's beloveds, as people necessary to our own survival. This active listening, of good listening, lets us know that we aren't alone. When we trust that we can go to God with everything, big or small, we ourselves are transformed to receive that from other people. Because we know that we matter to God, other people will start to matter to us. This transformation takes time because most of us don't have regular rhythms of taking time to listen to God or to others. But it does bear good and hopeful fruit in the long run. I'm the oldest of 4 kids in my family, with my brother being second at 2 years behind me. Growing up, we always played together. Our friends hung out, we could have fun and pick on each other, knowing it was all love. And as we've grown older, we've begun to see the world in pretty different ways. And I noticed that we'd lost some of the closeness in our relationship. We couldn't joke as much as we used to or have as much fun. I felt like every conversation was loaded, and I was starting to dread hanging out when we could. I'd get really hurt over little text messages, and I found it really easy to want to hurt him back. I think that was one of the first things that felt non-neutral, that made me stop and pay attention. Because that relationship had always been life-giving. It had always helped me remember God and to live as one of God's people. My relationship with my brother was a life-giving one that made me want to give life to others because of it. And when that started to shift, I found that it felt more like there was a spirit of death over that relationship. And I was more hateful, a more toxic person because of that relationship. I just had to listen to how God might be asking me to respond as a person of life instead of death. I think that that's actually a really important distinction here because God invites us to life and relationship. And so when we notice that we're starting to produce death, it's a cue to take a pause and listen. So how I do this, first I take a beat and I listen to God. A primary way that I do that is by listening to music or doing a somatic prayer, which is listening to God through your body. One of my favorites are doing a breath prayer or stretching and praying. When I listen this way, I hear the Spirit speaking and nudging me back to practice life. And how do I know what that looks like? I like to come back to the fruits of the Spirit as a way of checking how my life is aligning with Christ's or not. The opposite of life is death. It's that disconnection. And so when I listen this way in prayer, I find myself open to God's correction to deal with my own stuff, to deal with what's really going on underneath. And that is also an important distinction. When we aren't listening and we find ourselves disconnected from others, we often end up talking over each other. We start yelling or getting on our soapboxes, hoping to change the other person and close the gap. But some things never change. And people rarely do because they're yelled at. But God transformed death to life through Jesus and invites us to participate in that work too and promises to continue to transform us. So I can give over my initial reaction, listen to God, and step forward into transformation. So when I started to do that with my brother, I realized that I felt like he wasn't actually listening to me. We might have been talking about politics, but underneath our political differences were issues of what it means to love and care for my disabled son. It made it so that I couldn't just laugh about stuff anymore. Everything seemed to have a hidden meaning or an agenda, and I felt really isolated from my brother. In processing with God in prayer and with my husband and other trusted friends, I kept hearing the same thing. Are you listening to him? If you're feeling this way, maybe he is too. God isn't asking you to be an agent of death to your relationship, but to partner in the work of healing it. I made a conscious choice to try and listen to him more when we were back, not to formulate a counter argument or to talk over him. I tried to ask him questions about his life that got under the surface of our disagreements from his perspective. And actually, even though we didn't plan it, I found that he was doing the same thing for me. We were both paying attention to our tone, to our body language, our choice of words, and how they were received. I felt like he heard me for the first time in years. I felt loved and seen and known. I'm not sure if he did in the same way, but it feels like we're moving towards healing instead of away from it. And yes, I did ask him if I could share this story. So, hi, Cam. I love you. As we prepare as individuals, small groups, and congregations to navigate this next year, I'd invite you to consider who around you is a person you could listen to as a way of blessing them. I think it's really easy to try and help meet people's hurts through our charity work and money. I mean, these are really important, but by practicing listening to God and others, we let them know how important they are to us and to God. It's really easy for us and others to believe the lies that the deceiver will tell us about being alone, or that we don't have anything to offer to anyone else. But know your worth. The God of the universe is working and invites you to work with God to listen and heal. Listen to the Spirit of God in you this week. Are you feeling drawn to listen to someone in particular? Think about making the space to be present with them whenever you encounter them in the next month. One question you could start with is, what's your favorite song right now and why? Pastor Michael, our middle school pastor, asked a version of this question recently on his Facebook, and it made me stop and really consider that for myself. If you do ask someone, go and listen to that song, and then follow up with that person as a way of continuing the conversation. It lets them know that you listened and care. I'm going to ask this question this week on our social media, and so I'd love to build a playlist out of your responses so I can pray for you as I listen to those songs. So follow us on Facebook and Instagram and drop your replies in the comments. If you don't feel like you have natural pathways for connecting with someone right now, you can start practicing listening to people in the spaces that they do naturally share on their own. Pastor Justin has an awesome practice of using social media as a way of listening. He'll watch people's stories or reply to their posts asking questions. You can really get into the thick of it there. I know that for me, if someone takes the time to ask a question or write a thoughtful comment on one of my posts, I feel seen, known, and loved because of how they listened. When we listen to people's surface concerns, we can start to pay attention to the deeper stuff too, and pray that Christ's work in these spaces might be glorified. Remember, in this narrative from John, Jesus invited everyone into healing through listening to God, listening to the community, and participating together in restoration. This is kingdom work, where we are blessed to be a witness to Christ's healing restoration. We can demonstrate humility, honesty, and curiosity in our listening. As we listen to our friends and family, we start to hear about how their joys and struggles represent a necessary part of God's kingdom, and we can come alongside them as we seek healing with them in the broken parts of all of our lives together. Thanks be to God, who's never going to give you up, never going to let you down, and never going to run around and desert you.